How God Baby Made Sense of the Universe, as told to Dr. Matt Miller on and after February the 13th, 1998. The account of how I heard this story is almost as strange as the story itself. I had just read about Gusta-Ote, the cliff spirit, from whom the Senecan Indian stories are said to have originated. In the Native American legend, a hunter named Orphan Boy had found himself in converse with a cliff spirit named Gusta-Ote, who told him stories. After the stories ended, the hunter left his day's catch at the top of the cliff, thanked Gusta-Ote reverently, and went home. At that time, his people had no stories, so in the evening, when they gathered around the fire, he told them the stories of Gusta-Ote, and they listened and learned, and told the stories again among themselves. Each day he went hunting, and he would go to the cliff when he'd made a good catch, and Gusta-Ote would tell him more stories. Then he would leave the gift of his hunting and go home to tell the stories to his people. One day, after many fine tales, Gusta-Ote said that he had told all his stories. The storytelling was over. The hunter left his catch, thanked the storyteller reverently, and went home to tell the last stories. The Senecan people listened and learned, and the stories they tell today are the stories they learned from Gusta-Ote, the cliff spirit. I was interested in the extreme specificity of this. It didn't sound like a fairy tale so much as an account of something that actually did happen. But a cliff spirit? Oh, I decided to try it. In February and March of 1998, I sat at the base of the cliff overlooking the beach of Paradise Cove in Malibu, California, spine to stone. I entered mental silence and the willing suspension of disbelief, focused behind me into the cliff face, and asked, "Is anyone there?" I heard an answer. A conversation started. The cliff spirit had a name I couldn't even hope to pronounce. It was as long as a sentence. I asked him what it meant, and he said, "Oh, well, you know, he who dwells in the rocks and the sand and the sea and the sky and the..." Oh, wait, I interrupted him, seeing that this was not exactly the solution I was looking for. "Can I just call you he who dwells?" That was fine with him. So I got to the main business. I summarized the Gusta-Ote story, and the Malibu cliff spirit said that was perfectly plausible and very likely to have happened. "Can you tell me stories?" I asked. He who dwells said cheerfully that he'd been here in this cliff since the beginning. He had seen many things happen, and he could tell me stories from any century I pleased. Thrilled, I asked the big question. "Can you tell me the story of how the world came to be created in such a way that bad things happen to good people?" I thought I would have him there, but he didn't miss a beat. "Oh yes, I know that story," said he who dwells thoughtfully. "It was all just a misunderstanding, really. But it would take more than one session to tell." "I can come back every weekend. Look, I've got a notebook right here. I'll write down exactly what you say." There was a pregnant pause while he who dwells took in that I was really serious about this. And then he seemed to smile. "That would be fine," he said. "Well then, here's how it came about. This happened when it was dark." This happened when it was dark. There was a little moonlight on the water, and it was before the dawning, in the dark before the first day. Before the dawning lived Chaos in a little hut by the ocean, and she was small and old, ever so old, and bent over and ugly, uglier than you can even begin to imagine. And she lived by the ocean. All day she sat on a patch of sand, and the waves hurled themselves at the rocks, and the waves hurled themselves at the rocks. And everyone was different. Some came in big and threatening, and exploded on the gray-brown rocks with a great hurl of spray that spun and danced in mad white foam sculptures in the moonlight, leaping like white horses and bubbling right up to her thick, clumsy sandals. But the waves were broken on the rocks, and the sand ate them, and they were gone. Some came hissing in low in a line of foam across the wet white smoothness, hissing and hissing, climbing almost as high as the great thunderers. But they were broken on the rocks, and crept at the embroidered hem of her long peasant skirts, and the sand ate them, and they were gone. But none touched her, for she knew where to sit, and she called each wave by name, and they gave her greeting, and told her stories of what they had seen deep in the ocean, deep in the blackness far below. And they told her the salt and the grind from the smoking rocks spit at by the mountains had mixed and married and mingled and merged, and it was walking about on the ocean floor now and doing philosophy. At that Chaos laughed and asked the waves, "What is philosophy?" But the sand ate them before they could answer, and they broke upon the rocks, and they were gone. Then Mother Chaos stood up on the beach to make a magic, and she called the little sand crab to her that walked on the ocean floor and did philosophy. But before she was nearly finished her magic, a wave spilled over the rock and burst upon the sand at her feet, and it splashed the embroidered hem of her long peasant skirts and surprised her exceedingly, and she sat down unexpectedly on the sand. It wasn't long afterwards that Chaos had a child by ocean, a gurgling, naked baby boy, and she dandled him on her knee and loved him, for she'd been very lonely in her hut by the water, even though she had not known it was lonely until the baby came. Because she loved him, she named him God Baby. God Baby played on the beach and rolled in the waves of his father ocean, and they were very careful not to hurt him. But the little sand crab walked the ocean floor and did philosophy, and of course the time came when God Baby noticed that. When they first came face to face on the sand, God Baby was most surprised, for the only people he knew were his mother Chaos and his father Ocean, and neither one of them had 6 legs and snippy claw things on the ends of their arms, and neither one of them did philosophy. God Baby thought it most clever of little sand crab. "Teach me some philosophy, little sand crab," God Baby said, expectantly setting down the gourd rattle Chaos had given him. "I'm all attention." Little sand crab was almost 14 feet high, but God Baby looked big to him. And little sand crab sidled forward sideways because he was a little nervous, and he beckoned with one heavy claw. "Come here," he whispered, with a rattling sound like a storm wave on a rocky beach. "Come here, and I will teach you some philosophy." So God Baby crawled over to where little sand crab stood and listened expectantly. "Do you see all that?" asked Sand Crab, waving at the ocean with his heavy claw. "I see it," said God Baby, looking at it expectantly, but he had not really looked at it before. It made him feel older. "It doesn't make any sense," said Sand Crab. God Baby stared at him for a long time, and then he stared at the water. There was a thoughtful pause. God Baby felt older than ever. "Go away now, Sand Crab," he said petulantly. "You're giving me a headache." And little Sand Crab sidled away sideways because he was still a little nervous about God Baby. He didn't know why. It was just a feeling he had. God went home to the little hut and found Mother Chaos baking sand cakes among the rocks around back. "Where have you been?" she asked, bending over the rocks busily. I've been talking to sand crab. It's giving me a headache, said God irritably. Uh-oh, said Mother Chaos, straightening up. What has he been telling you? He told me the ocean doesn't make any sense, said God. I never thought about it that way before. I feel older. Then Mother Chaos looked at him and saw he was not a baby, but a slender, tall young man, a young man with what were, at the moment, worried eyes. You're not God, baby, anymore, she told him sadly. He just arched his eyebrows at her and turned away. Looking out over the broad ocean, he raised his arms wide over his head. Sand crab is right. Doesn't make any sense, he said. I'm going to go sit on the beach and think about this. And he did. But little sand crab came around for some sand cakes, as he always did in the evening. And when Mother Chaos saw him, she gave him a look that went right through him like a hot knife through butter. And he sidled away sideways because he suddenly felt extremely nervous. Walk always so, said she, making up a magic on the spot. She was so angry. For you have taught my child philosophy. And since that day, crabs have always walked sideways because of the mischief their father, little sand crab, made with God in the dawn of time. But God sat on the beach and thought and thought, and as he thought, he grew older. God sat on the beach and thought and thought and thought and thought until his forehead wrinkled. The waves came in and the waves went out, and he thought and sat and sat and thought. Chaos watched him from the doorway of the hut, but she said nothing. It was too late for that. After 2 nights and 2 days, he saw that the sky made sense, and he was pleased. But he did not move from his place in the sand, or stir so much as a finger. And the waves came in, and the waves went out. After 3 nights and 3 days more, he saw that the rocks and the sand made sense. He thought after that the rest would be easy, and he smiled a little. And the waves went in, and the waves went out. In 1 more night and 1 more day, he saw that the restless surface of the boundless sea made sense, and he understood the waves, and the spray, and the foam to the finest fleck. And he was very pleased with himself now, and he couldn't wait to tell little sand crab. Wouldn't he be surprised? And on the last night, God set out to make sense of the darkness in the murky depths of the ocean, and why it was like the darkness in the sky. He planned on wrapping up by lunchtime, and having a big pancake feast with Mother Chaos outside the little hut to celebrate. But it didn't make sense. Everything else was light. The whole thing was based on light. God had made sense out of it all because of the light that pervaded everything. But deep in the murky dark of the ocean, great shapes he could not see fought and tore at each other's flesh, and the light could not penetrate. For a night and a day, God strained and struggled at the problem. All the world he had woven into a singing harmony, the sky and the rocks and the sea and the sand, all a glorious chorus of light without a sour note in the choir. But the dark of the ocean did not sing. It was silent there, black, and death went unredeemed. It made no sense. In the dawn of the 8th day, Chaos came out to find her son. She'd baked a lot of pancakes and they were getting cold. She found him in a sorry state. He was crawling on the sand, crying out, "It doesn't make sense! It doesn't make any sense! I don't understand!" And he was old as the mountains, and his beard was long and white. "What doesn't make sense, you loony?" she shouted at him, sounding angry because she was worried and scared. "The sea! The sea!" he sobbed. Mother Chaos gathered her wailing child in her arms and felt him shaking all over against her. "My poor baby," she whispered. "Of course it doesn't make any sense. I'm going to make that sand crab into a bouillabaisse." But when she lifted him, so old and withered he was light as a feather in her arms, from under his hands 2 tiny figures fled across the sand. "Eek!" squealed Mother Chaos, lifting her skirts and almost dropping God. "What are they?" And she fairly ran for the little hut. But God looked over her shoulder with mad eyes, and he whispered, "Solve it for me. Make sense of the darkness in the sea." When first man and first woman reached the shelter of the huge, laborious jungle, they were almost exhausted from slogging through the sand. They collapsed together under a bayberry leaf and looked back over the vast expanse of the beach to the sea gleaming in the moonlight. "Did you see them?" he gasped, puffing for breath. "Monsters!" she cried. "Look!" He grabbed her arm and pointed. They watched as darkness seemed to pour upwards into the sky, obscuring the stars. The moon winked out like a snuffed candle. "There's a storm coming up," she said practically. "I'm cold." "Wrap yourself in these," he suggested, scrabbling huge dead brown leaves up from the forest floor. One leaf was just the right size to wrap each of them up nicely, and first man and first woman sat side by side under the bayberry bush, each wrapped in a dry leaf, like a couple of tortillas. They watched the storm build together. "It's so dark," she complained. "I don't like it," he said, looking nervously at the quiet sea and the windless sky being swallowed by darkness. "It doesn't make any sense." First woman gave him a very queer look. "Of course it doesn't," she said a bit contemptuously. "Why should it?" God got a cold from sitting out on the sand for 7 days and nights, and he was very sick. They did not discuss what had happened. Mother Chaos only referred to it obliquely as "your queer spell." But each, in their own way, thought about it long and hard. The end result of Mother Chaos's thinking was to call up little Sand Crab, who had been making himself very scarce since he'd come around for his usual evening sandcakes, and found himself walking sideways to the end of all his generations. He sidled up to her most reluctantly, walking sideways now because he couldn't walk any other way. Mother Chaos said nothing, but she gave him such a look. There was a sharp report. The sand crab exploded in a shower of fragments. When the fragments hit the sand, they turned into tiny sand crabs, so small Mother Chaos could barely see them, and they scuttled towards the sea, running sideways because that was their way. "There," said Mother Chaos, turning back into the doorway of the hut. "Let's see you do philosophy like that." But it was not a storm. First Man was right. It didn't make sense in the terms they knew. It was just blackness. Blackness pouring from deep within the sea up into the sky. Soon the moon was gone, and in the inky dark he heard First Woman whimper with fear. "Hold me," she whispered. He climbed out of his bayberry leaf and felt her bare skin in the dark. They clung to each other, naked and afraid, listening to the wind rise to a howl. Their hearts beat wildly, at first with terror, but then with love. And around them, under the giant bayberry leaves, an earthly glow gradually illuminated the dark. He saw her face, and her eyes shone like stars as she kissed him. Her body was lit from within by an inner fire, and his hands shone when he touched her. Slowly they drew apart, breathing fast. The clearing under the bayberry bush was filled with an eerie light. "Doesn't make any sense," she agreed. "We have to do something." "I think we have," he said softly, gesturing at the pool of light all around them. But for answer, she pointed wordlessly at the dark beyond. They had only made a very small clearing with their love. "We have to do something," he echoed. "The darkness came from the ocean. Then that is where it must be healed." "But the ocean is forbidden," he worried, "and there were monsters, 2 of them." She stood up, her naked body shining with its own light. "I shall go," she said, and strode forth into the blackness. For long he saw her pale form, shining like a star as she strode down the beach. Then the darkness swallowed her, and she was gone. First Man sat cross-legged in the clearing and wondered what he ought to do. He was afraid of the dark, but it was already decided for him. For without her, there was no love, and without love, there could be no light. Slowly the glow she cast faded, and he found himself in blackness. When First Woman reached the water's edge, where the waves went in and the waves went out, she did not hesitate. The ocean was forbidden, but the blackness came from deep within it, and it must be healed. She walked straight into the dark water. It splashed about her ankles, her knees, her thighs, her waist. But the ocean knew well that the woman was forbidden to enter it, and when it saw her stride right into it, it rose up in fury, making a mighty wave that wrapped her round and dragged her down. She gave one despairing cry and sank, full of water, the ocean's arm about her waist. Where she had been, bubbles rose and broke, and then there was nothing. First Man had delayed until the light went out, and he had the devil of a time finding his way out of the bayberry patch. Leaves grabbed him, trailing vines tripped him up. He skinned his knee on rocks and fell full length. But at last he found the sand. He could tell which way the ocean lay by the sound of the waves. Anyway, the beach slanted down that way. But no sooner had he figured this out than a bolt of lightning split the black sky wide open. First man realized that things were worse than they had known. The blackness had seized the light and was using it ill. Another jagged streak of light hissed into the bayberry bushes where he had been only a moment ago, and they burst into flame. He stared back in horror at their little glade, now a crackling inferno. There would be no going back, but forward there was only blackness and the hiss of the sea. A heavy bridge crashed down and rolled onto the beach, one end alive with fire. Then he had an idea. He seized the other end and held the burning brand aloft. A torch! Holding it high, he ran down the beach into the darkness, and the blazing bayberry bridge illuminated his steps with flame. Suddenly, a huge shape loomed high above him. He heard a swish of skirts and saw by the torch's flickering flare that one of the monsters was standing over him. She looked like a bent old lady in embroidered peasant skirts and a puffy white blouse, but she towered like a tall tree. Naked, First Man faced her. Thinking of his woman, he knew he could not turn back. "Shoo!" he said ridiculously, waving the torch and jabbing it at her. "Go home!" The monster peered at him, and he shut his eyes, waiting for the end. Would it hurt? Would she pick him up and bite his head off, or just grind him to paste under her sandals? Then he heard a noise like hilarious thunder and opened one eye cautiously. She shouted with laughter and stumped away. First Man watched her go, unable to believe it. He scared her away. Amazing. The woman! Remembering, he ran down to the sea. Where was she? He held his torch high, searching. Nothing. Nothing but a bayberry leaf floating in and out on the unending waves. She must have gone to sea, he realized. I have to follow her. I have to help. That bayberry leaf was pretty close into shore. He waded out into the water, grabbed it by the stem, and pulled it behind him into shallow water. He climbed onto the bayberry leaf, its flat bottom balancing easily. He pushed the end of his torch into the fat vein running down its center. It stuck there and stood aloft, light blazing from the flame at its top. He tore a piece off the end of the leaf and bound it to the mast with fibrous strips that he tore from the stem like strong string. Another strip of fiber he bound about the loose corner of this improvised sail for a mainsheet. The wind caught his sail in a second and thrust his little boat out through the waves, almost capsizing him. But then he was in a small harbor of quiet swells, protected by arms of rock reaching out on each side. Beyond was wild water. Clenching his teeth in the stem of the leaf, he dragged in and eased up on the main sheet until he had her heading out for the open ocean. He found he could steer her better by pulling the stem to the side where he wanted to go, like a rudder. That and the main sheet together could be used to guide his little craft quite well in this calm, quiet water. The red light of his torch burned at the head of the mast and reflected strangely on the black water around him. But he tried not to look at those reflections or think about what might be under the water, waiting for him. It was easy going at first. The water was almost flat and still, and his little bayberry leaf boat rode easily over the gentle swells. A rift opened in the clouds, and blue sky showed for a moment, casting an eerie blue glow over the black water. It came out like a pathway to meet him from the open ocean between the headlands of rock. The ocean looked very wild indeed. He gulped and set her head for that gateway into the maelstrom. When he reached the mouth of the harbor, there was a deep-throated clanging that grew louder and louder. At first, he could not tell where it came from. It was all around him. But then as he passed into the rough water outside the harbor, he swept past a rusty, barnacle-laden old bell buoy, dripping seaweed. It was black, with a white 7 on it, and it swung and swung in the surge, calling its warning hoarsely over the sea. He wanted to heed it and turn back, but he knew he was on her path. He must go on. Somewhere ahead, she needed him. When he was in the open ocean, the waves were tremendous. They towered over him like mountains. He could not control the boat in this seething cauldron, but the wind bore him willy-nilly up one steep black slope, spun him about like a top on the wave's crest, and hurtled him down the other side. He was petrified and crouched naked in the cup of the leaf, soaked with freezing spray, clutching the sheet in his makeshift sail desperately. Gradually he realized the boat wasn't going to turn over. It skimmed up the enormous waves like a live thing, spun in foam on unimaginable crests, where for a moment he had a dizzying view of the endless parade of gray wave tops marching off into the blackness. The torch shone like a beacon at the masthead, burning now not with flame but with a piercing lambent fire. Then he skidded down the other side, wallowing and rolling in the trough, until the wind caught his sail again and chased him up another mountainous crest. The wind grew to a gale. It whisked him to the top of a huge swell where it would not let him go down into the less blustery trough, but held him there, no longer climbing and falling, but riding the crest like a thing of foam and a storm rack spinning into infinity. He looked around him. Huge fish swam abreast of him, bigger than his entire boat. They were on both sides of him, before and behind. He watched him with intelligent eyes, and in the madness of the storm and the terror of the moment, he thought he saw friendship. They were all around him, giant creatures in a sort of formation. One huge fish was in the lead, the others spreading out behind him in a wedge of gleaming black shoulders and spouting blowholes. He realized that he and his boat were part of the formation, and even as he realized that, something extraordinary happened. As he stared ahead through the hissing spray, the lead fish leaped from the water. Once, twice, thrice it leaped, and the third time it did not come down again. It was actually swimming in the air. He could see its fins working, see the great tail turn and thrash. They followed it down into a trough between two mountainous rivers, and, turning, tore along the trough like it was a tunnel, still in the wedge-shaped formation of glistening black bodies, with him at the center of the wedge. Suddenly, far ahead, the tunnel of water seemed to open, and a huge round moon filled it up like light fills a cup. The lead fish was silhouetted in air against it, a great, graceful black shape hurtling down the wind. But already they were bearing down him, moving as he suddenly realized at incredible speed, outstripping the wind itself. So the air tore at his face and snatched the sail from his frozen fingers. Even as he saw the moon, he felt the boat leave the water, and he was sailing upwards into the light. The fish peeled off to each side and were gone, and he sailed alone up into the clouds in the light of the gigantic moon. Ahead of him, against the moon, he could still see the first fish, leaping and plunging through the air, far ahead. He passed clouds like islands, clouds like seas, clouds like lanterns of fish. His boat was translucent now. He could see through it, like it was made of water or air. He held up his hand and could see through his own palm to where the bones glowed with their own moon-like light. And suddenly, he understood. Ahead on his right, he saw something like a star shining, huge and close, so close he could sail right up to it. But its light was darkness, and the light that was dark shone out from it in a concentric glow of nothingness, where palm trees perched. The air was very still. There far below he could hear the roar of the sea. The fish were gone. On the dark star of nothing was a little house, made it seem all of white marble. He docked the bayberry leaf boat on a little beach, near where the gazebo stood. And across the close-cropped lawn, the first woman came, robed in white. He stepped from the boat, and she embraced him. She took his hand and led him into the gazebo. The light that was darkness came through the marble and filled the room with an eerie glow that turned shadow to light and light to shadow. He had seen a pale simulacrum of that glow before, in the bayberry clearing, after he held her for the first time. Here, it pervaded everything. He turned to face her. She was dark, all dark, and he could see the stars through her. Turning, she undid a pin at her shoulder, and the robe fell from her. He too was made of nothing, and he knew she was naked. He touched her shoulder with a hand, through which the big bear winked and was gone. Ursa Major and Pole Star. Orion swaggered across her bared black breasts and belly. They were nothing. They lay together on the soft couch, in a dappling of light and shadow. At first he was on top, but after he entered her, they rolled over, and she sat astride him, her head flung back, the wind lifting her long hair, and the stars burning and burning through her hair. She saw him off at the little dock, no longer a shape of nothingness, but still translucent with memory, woman of living glass with a skeleton of glowing light within. He turned the little boat and pushed off, seeing his own skin take flesh and form and solidity as he sailed away, until he could see the boat through himself no more, and he was as real as it was. The wind was still with him, and he knew it must have turned. They must have changed it while they were in the gazebo. It blew fresh and cool and sweet now, and everywhere was warmth. He sailed away down the long clouding of stars. There was moonlight all around, and he could see down into the water below, all the way to the ocean floor, where tiny sand crabs walked in ignorance, waiting for evolution to make them wise. He landed on the water's gray-green breast, soft as a feather in the wind, and skimmed through the waves towards the harbor. Behind him, light grew like a rising chord, louder and stronger, and looking back, he saw the sun burst from the ocean and flood the planet with light. The darkness had retreated into the fastnesses of the ocean. It was the first day. Soon he was close enough to see the cliff, and high upon its edge he saw her, robed in white. She was waving to him. She shouted something, but he could not hear her. He passed the buoy bell, and it struck once and was silent, swinging on the swells as he swept into calm water. He landed at the little beach, and she was waiting for him there by the water's edge, the foam lapping at her bare feet under the white robe like her faithful dog. As he climbed off the bayberry leaf, she waded into the water and took him in her arms. Together they pulled the boat up on the shore in the dawning. Across its foam-crusted form, their eyes met. "It is light," she whispered. "Yet that is not all," he answered, soft and low. "No," she said, and he saw a light of understanding catch and glow in her eyes. "All is nothing." When she spoke these words, a tension discharged in the air about them, and beach, sea, shore, rocks, and harbor shimmered, grew translucent for a moment, so looking down at the rocks at his feet, he saw through them the stars that shone on the other side of the planet, and then it all went out like a candle and was gone. In the little hut, God sat up in bed excitedly. "Nothing!" he cried. "Of course," said Mother Chaos comfortably. "Go to sleep now." And that was the beginning of the first day that God lay sick in bed. But outside, the nothing took the form of his dreams, and its form was a birch forest where two streams met at the top of a waterfall. God sat up in bed, wide-eyed. The humans had not made sense of the dark as he sent them to do, but he began to see, from what they did do, another way. When his humans made love on the dark star, Light was dark, and dark was light. That did not pull it into sense, it eliminated sense. Underpinning all that made sense was nothing, undifferent substratum of natureless force. And the nothing, source of all things, and yet the only reality, was God himself. He separated into light and dark, sense and no sense when they looked at him. When they looked away, he was neither sense nor nonsense. He was one, undifferent. God lay back, satisfied. Pictures rose in his mind as he watched Mother Chaos working over the big black iron stove. "What are you cooking up?" he asked. She glanced at him and saw a young man, fine-featured, with deep, cool eyes. No longer ancient and ugly, the cure had begun. "Oh, nothing," she answered. "A treat for your human beings." He stared at the low wooden ceiling, counting the cracks. Slowly his eyes flickered closed, and God fell asleep. In his sleep came dreams beyond all words, beyond all knowing. Of these we can draw but a scribble of a sketch of a picture of a photograph of a movie. Yet it will speak for the dream it was. He dreamed lights sparkled upon the water, not everywhere, but in one place alone. The waves were still, and the sky was nothing. It rose to emptiness. Yet the light gave it form which was illusion, making it appear to be a blue inverted bowl. And that was the seventh world. It contained all else within it. Then clouds boiled up from the water and rose to fill the bowl until only a patch of blue remained. And the clouds stilled the light everywhere but in that patch of blue. There the sun still sparkled on the water, but everywhere else the water was gray. And so it seemed the clouds were something, for they blocked the light, and darkness crept in below them. Yet they were also nothing but mist and vapor, a layer of illusion below the layer of the inverted blue bowl that was not the sky. And their illusion was more solid, but no more real. It contained everything but the blue bowl of the sky. And it was the sixth world, created from the sky when it meets the water. Then rain fell from the gray clouds, first in a drizzle and then in a steady downpour. And the rain joined the clouds to the sea. And it was more solid than the clouds, for they were but mist and vapor. The rain was water itself. And it made a wall of gray that stopped the light, and darkness dwelt within it. And that was the fifth world. But this also was illusion, for it was not solid. It was only water droplets. And it was made of the same stuff as the clouds that created it. The rain fell upon the echoing sea, full of the light and darkness of the rain and the clouds in the sky. And the sea seemed something, for it blocked the light, and fell heavily upon the beach in waves that thundered and thumped. Yet this also was illusion, for the sea could be swept aside and passed through as if it were not. And this was the fourth world, that seemed solidest of all, but it was created by the rain from the clouds from the sky, and it was no less an illusion than they. The sea was held in the cup of the mountains, and the mountains were hard and firm and stopped the light and cast shadows of darkness in it. Surely these were solid. But they were made of grains that were made of grains that were made of grains, and between the grains vast abysses of nothing stretched, and were at last all that was there. So the mountains, too, were illusion, for they rose from the sea, that came from the rain, that came from the clouds, that came from the sky, and that came from nothing. And the mountains were the third world, and this was where God's human beings dwelt. Within the mountains were caves of blackness, where light had never been and would never be. And the blackness was like a solid form of dark that light could not penetrate. But through the blackness, water ran laughing from the mountains, from the sea, from the rain, from the clouds, from the sky. And the water passed freely where light could not, and it came from nothing. So was the darkness also illusion, though it seemed solid. And this was the second world, and here the fears of the night dwelt, and tormented the human streams. And deep in the caves of night Water hissed and sank into bubbling molten rock that glowed red, hot as hellfire. And this was the very place of light, for it boiled and heaved with glowing color, and was the stuff of stars, the molten core. And the light in the sky was this same light, but from a distant star. Here in the caves of night burned our own star, cloaked in dark. And yet its burning only made the stones of the mountains in the caves of night, and the water ran through it laughing and bore it away into darkness, for the light too was nothing, and all its heat and fearful play an illusion of emptiness. And this was the first world, and here too God dwelt in his home, though his name was different by the shores of fire. All this God saw in his dream, although all this, as it is written, is no more like what God saw than a mole is like a martinet, for God was growing up. He was no longer prone to illusion, nor deceived by the riddles of silly sand crabs. And he saw that he had split into 7 layers, and that was his sickness and his injury. But he could not be whole again because he had cast part of himself away. And he wanted his humans back, for they were part of him. Without them he was incomplete and divided into 7 layers, and he could not be healed. But alas, he had cast them out carelessly in his desperation, when he'd seen that Sand Crab was right, and they'd fallen far from him, even to the 3rd world. And the way back was long and arduous for them. Said God thoughtfully, this is going to take a while. And he cast about in his mind for a pattern for them to walk that would bring them home again. He remembered the quest of first woman, how she had gone forth and broken the taboos of ocean to bring back light into darkness. He remembered how ocean had swallowed her up in anger, and she had risen from ocean's belly as a water spirit to a place where dark was light and light was dark, and both were prone to nothing. And he remembered how first man had gone after her in his little bayberry leaf boat, and found her on her dark star, and made love to her there. And he remembered how first man had come home again, and found her now in both places, woman and spirit, in the 3rd world with him, and yet still connected to the nothing of infinite space. And God made a magic, his first magic, and not bad at all for a beginner. In fact, it was a very great magic indeed, for he cast those memories of the quest of first woman and first man across the 7 worlds as a pattern for his human beings to walk that would bring them home through 7 worlds to nothing, and bring them home to him. But great as God's magic was, chaos made it greater. For from the love-making of first man and first woman, she cooked up a 3rd, from her memory of God baby, as he was in the very beginning, so little and cute and all. And because first woman had risen very near the 7th world from the belly of Father Ocean, Mother Chaos pressed that memory into the belly of first woman as a mark of the greatness of her quest. Down in the 3rd world, first woman lay crying, and first man did not know what to do, for his lover had swelled up most unnaturally, and she was weeping with pain. He buried his face in his hands and tugged at his hair, pacing up and down outside the cave, none of which did her any good at all, of course. But then he heard another cry, a different voice, and he hurried into the cave, biting his knuckles with anxiety, his hair all over the place. And first woman lay at peace now, strangely deflated, and upon her breast was a tiny woman like herself. "It is first child," she said. "I shall call her Goddess, because I love her so. She shall counsel us with new wisdom. You're not jealous, are you?" And first man knelt by her side and kissed her tenderly, and kissed the child at her breast. And first child watched him gravely, with eyes that were full of wisdom, for they had nothing in them. God looked out from the eyes of first child, and he realized this was going to be a problem, for the child was also a piece of him, and would have to discover the pattern anew for herself and walk it to return to him. And he knew, for he was gaining wisdom now, that these three fragments of himself might need to be born as children and seek the pattern and die many times before they found their way home. And the children as whom they would be born would be countless as the grains of sand upon the shore. And that was what Mother Chaos cooked up on her big black iron stove. She always did like children. God sat in the doorway of the little hut and gazed out upon infinite space. There were no stars. There was nothing out there. And he was all of it, all the nothing. He sat in the doorway, a middle-aged man in a business suit, with eyes that were a little sad. From the black knotness around him and his hut, two forms grew, man and woman, clothed in rough tunics sewn from leaves. They were playing hopscotch with a stone. Around them faded into his view a sphere of stars. Among the stars they threw the stone, hopped, balanced on one foot. He heard them laughing and talking, tiny voices as if from a great distance. A third watched them gravely, sitting in a nebula, a baby girl. The stars shone through their empty forms, there and not there, made a star shine, nova light, full as mist is full, casting no shadow, hopping and balancing on the darkness between the stars. Baby gurgled, laughing. They were of the stuff of the seventh world, most rarefied substance of God. God breathed in, drawing it all into his center. For a moment they winked out, man and woman, woman and child. God breathed out, and they swayed again into being. They were more solid now, cloudy but opaque. He threw the stone and jumped two-footed, turned and hopped back. Around his cloudy form, a shell of light shone. Satisfied, God breathed in, slow as the sea upon the stars. The cloud forms wisped and vanished, leaving only shapes of light, playing hopscotch in the stars. Again God breathed out, wave patient, shaping the breath as it passed like he was blowing smoke rings. Stars poured from his mouth, flooding the emptiness. Within that burst of light, the two hopped, turned, picked up their stone, their forms liquid, glistening. Vapor shapes contained them and gave them a gleaming glow, halo of light. He drew the stars in with his breath, but the figures held their form, water shapes shining in the blackness, frozen like ice until the outbreath. The sky studded, flooded with light. Novas, constellations, outbreathing of God. Solid as earth, the players took on flesh, the game firm on greenish dry mud now. You could see the marks of the game, squares and ovals drawn with a white stone. Embodied, she threw the stone with tan brown fingers, firm and sure, jumped in flesh, looked over at him and gave a triumphant cry. "I win," she crowed, and he released an exultant peal like a seabird. The baby laughed and gurgled, and God breathed in, and it was all gone in a blink. Stars, green mud, players and all. Only nothing remained. God stood up, stretching. "That was a pretty good session," he said. "You get back in bed now," Mother Chaos scolded. "That's enough excitement for one day." God obeyed without argument, for he was indeed feeling a trifle queer. That night he dreamed of a forest, a birch forest where two streams met. That was how the world began. "Mommy," said First Child, "tell me a story. Tell me about when Father Ocean ate you up." First Woman looked at her daughter with loving eyes. She was a sturdy 4-year-old now, brown as a berry and fresh as spring water. Long brown hair, so dark as to be almost black, fell over her shoulder in curves that shone in the firelight. She was snuggled up against the rock just inside the cave, lying on the fine sand that sparkled when the flames jumped. Outside it was black dark, and they could hear the sound of the ocean. First Man sat up quietly to listen. He loved the story almost as much as First Child, although they had both heard it many times before. He brushed his black hair out of his eyes and said, "Yes, tell us that story. I cannot sleep." "Very well," answered First Woman, "but only one story. Already it is late." She put a few more sticks on the fire and picked up her bone comb. Combing it through her ash-blonde hair, she began to speak in a rhythmic voice, and the story magic grew around her listeners from the fire and the nighttime and the sing-song sound of her voice in the air. "It was in the beginning of things," she said, "before the dawning of the first day. The sun had not yet come, but there were stars. And a darkness rose from Father Ocean, and it ate up the stars, and we were afraid, O First Child, and that was how it was. So I rose to my feet, and I went down the sand of the ocean to stop the darkness, for it was eating the stars, and that was wrong. But I was not allowed to go into the ocean, for it was forbidden. When I reached ocean, I broke the taboo, and I walked right into him. The water came up to my ankles, and I was afraid, but I kept on going. And the water came up to my knees, and I felt his anger, but I kept on going. And the water came up to my thighs, and his fury was like a gust of hot wind across the water, for I had broken the taboo and violated the sacred place. But I kept on going, First Child, because the darkness was eating up the stars, and that was wrong. Then Father Ocean rose up against me in anger and threw a great cold wet arm around my waist and pulled me down, and I cried out, but he stopped my mouth with water. My breath ran out of my body in bubbles, and I drowned in his arms. It was not a pleasant moment for me. But to my surprise, I found that was not the end of things. I saw my body floating in the water, with the hair all around my face and my eyes open and staring. I knew I had shed it like a piece of clothing, but I was still there, outside my body, because I was finished with it. And yet, I still had a body, but it was made of water, like ocean, and it could not drown. Then Father Ocean took my hand and led me down the ocean floor, through the great mazes of coral and stone, through glorious labyrinths of pink green, swaying with green seaweed, fields of pale green reeds, and the twisting shapes of the red coral in the reef. And deep within the reef, he had a palace such as I had never seen, for its windows were all of white alabaster, and the floor was mussel shells like cobblestones beneath my bare feet, and the roof was a roof of violet fronds of kelp that ever swayed and parted and joined. And in the center of the hall was a black double throne, black as night. There Father Ocean sat himself on the right hand, and he gestured at the empty throne on his left. "Come live with me, be my consort," said he, in a voice like thunder across the water. "I like you, you've got guts, all this shall be yours." And he waved his hand, and there on the floor, there, my love, was a great heap of pearls and twisted gold and silver, all tumbled together higgledy-piggledy as it came from the ocean. "Riches," he whispered, "beauty beyond your wildest dreams." But I stepped back from the hand he held out to me, and I shook my head. "I have a consort already," I answered, "for I am First Man's woman, and he expects me back in time for supper." "You can never return," he whispered, in that hissing voice like waves on the sand. But I saw in his eyes, deep black pools of light they were, and filled with shifting wisdom. I saw in his eyes that he was lying, and I shook my head. "Oh yes, I can," I said. "You'll see." And with those words, The palace and the heap of gold and Father Ocean were gone, like the breath of a dream, O first child, and I was alone in the dark. But above me was a light that wavered and shimmered, came and went, and because I was water in the water, I rose towards it by simply willing myself up. And the light grew brighter and brighter, and I broke from the surface of the water and found myself in the air, hovering above the ocean. It was raining up there, a downpour that pelted the waves and made little splashes like tiny sailboats as it hit. When I looked down, I saw my body of water floating there, and as I watched, it dissolved into the waves and was gone, and I knew I had drowned again and shed my body of water like a second piece of clothing. But I was still there, outside my body, because I had finished with it, and yet I still had a body, but it was made of rain and could not get wet. And lo, Father Ocean was there in the rain with me, and he took my hand and led me upwards until we had entered the storm. The wind curled about us and beat at us, but we were made of rain, and it passed through us and was gone. "Come with me," he said, "O first woman, and I shall show you a greater palace than that." We traveled through the rain for what seemed like a long time, but I never grew weary or cold or tired. Finally, we came to a place where the sheets of water falling from the sky formed walls, gray, grim walls like a castle keep. And we entered through a parting in that veil of rain, and within was a great hall, where the rain swayed and parted, leaving it open within. And in that hall was a great gray double throne. And Father Ocean seated himself upon the right-hand throne, and gestured with his hand to the left hand. "Be my consort," he said. "I shall not ask you again. All this shall be yours." And he pointed with one finger at the gray floor of rain. And there I saw the whole world spread out like a map upon the floor, and all that was in it was mine to play with, like a great miniature toy world. But I shook my head and stepped away from his outstretched hand. "I already have a consort," I answered, "for I am first man's woman, and I do not wish to play with the world, I wish to heal it." At that he gave a great shout of anger. There was a burst of light like an explosion. I felt myself shattered into a million separate droplets, and I knew I was dead this time. But my seeing did not stop. I hovered in air, and below I saw my body of rain mingle and merge with the rain itself, and fall dissembled to the shore. And it was only a mist, or vapor, and I was among the clouds, high above the rain now. I had shed my body of rain like a third piece of clothing, but still I was I, and I did not die. And there among the clouds he came forth to meet me, and he was no longer Father Ocean, but a one greater than that, whose name I know not. And I could not look at him for the brightness of his form, but when I glimpsed him from the corner of my eye, I saw he was not light, but dark, and I was afraid. I fell to my knees, but I felt his hand in mine, and he raised me up gently to my feet, and said, "Come, first woman, you have journeyed far. Come rest with me a while, and we shall tell tales of what will be in the world one day." And he led me among the clouds. It was not long before we reached a great towering pinnacle of clouds, like a palace of frosted ice. And therein we entered, and the glory of that place was greater than my words can tell, for the walls were of mist, and the pillars of rain, and the floor was made of water, upon which we walked like solid stone. But the ceiling was made of light, and I had never seen such light before, yellow and warm and good upon my shoulders. For remember, O first child, that we had never seen the sun, there in the dawning, before the first day. And that great and glorious being showed me a double throne, and it was made of nothingness, empty, and I could see the stars through it. But he did not sit upon it. Instead, he only bowed and offered me a place. Yet I was afraid. I knew not which seat to take, and I felt it was wrong. "What about the darkness?" I asked in a voice that quavered and cracked. "What about the darkness that eats the stars?" And the throne was gone, and the palace, and the light, and I was alone among the clouds with my question in an instant. And I rose from my body of mist and vapor, and saw it lying below me dead upon a shelf of cloud. And as I watched, it misted to nothing and blew away in a faint breeze. And then I was afraid indeed, for I had no body. I was a naked spirit of nothing. I rose from the clouds and found myself in the emptiness above, and a voice spoke in my ear. I was going to offer you the light as your toy for all time, and great would have been your joy of it, the voice said. But you have asked the question, and you shall be answered in kind. And this is your answer, a question for a question. What is the secret of all the worlds? And I floated there in my nothing body, and I thought upon all I had seen. And years seemed to pass like stately trees in a mist, as I brooded upon the question. And once, I almost answered that the secret of the worlds was nothing, for surely nothing was behind it all. But there was something wrong with that. Nothing was what the secret was made of, but not what the secret was. Still I hovered in thought. Finally I spoke. All the empty air seemed to bend and listen. The secret is water, I said, for it is everywhere, nor light nor dark, full of life and full of death, the nothing from which everything came. It seeks the lowest place, and yet it rules all things. And even Father Ocean and Mother Chaos were born of water, even the consort of clouds and Godchild himself. Now, what about this darkness that eats the stars? And in an instant the empty air was filled with laughter, the laughter of a parent found out in his prank. And I found myself laughing with it, and it was well. In the empty air I saw an island made of light, but the light was dark, and through it I saw the stars as if there was nothing there, and yet it was solid and real, and the palm trees bent in the wind. And on that island was a little gazebo made of alabaster. And I came unto that island, and I was with form again, and my form was of a naked woman, and my skin was black as ebony and white as ivory at once. And through myself I could see the winking stars and the blackness of infinite space. When I stepped onto that island and felt the fine sand between my toes, my form seemed to harden into flesh, and I wore a robe of brownish white flecked with stars. I felt the wind in my hair, and I looked out from the shore over the whole world, seeing the ocean all the way down to the ocean floor, and the land all the way down through the caves of blackness to the fire that burns in the center. And it was not to play with, but to heal. And I saw the blackness that ate the world, and through that blackness there came a little boat. I stepped out to the shore to meet it, and it sailed right up to me, made of a bayberry leaf, its sail all tattered and torn. And in the boat was First Man, and did he look a sight! His hair was all over the place, and his fingers were blue with cold. He looked like he'd been fighting a bear. What a mess he was! Oh, I was glad to see him, First Child, and I greeted him on the shore, and we hugged each other, as man and wife should. But I did not forget my question, and I knew now what we had to do about the blackness that ate the stars. Water was very close, but it was not the answer. And I led him into the little gazebo. And there, oh First Child, you made me, piped up First Child happily. Yes, said First Woman, we made you. And we never saw that blackness again, murmured First Man. No, she said, laying down her bone comb, we never did. And now, chickabiddies, it is time to sleep. And First Woman blew out the fire like a candle, and the cave was dark but for the light of the stars that shone and would shine forever. But in the darkness, First Child's voice spoke softly, blurry already with sleep. The answer was love, wasn't it, Mommy? She asked. Yes, said First Woman. The answer was love. And that was the story told to me by he who dwells, the cliff spirit. I wrote it down exactly as he told it, putting a line of asterisks between each weekend story session. These were sometimes quite short and sometimes quite long. The story reminds us that we are a part of God, sent out to stop the darkness from eating the stars. The way that we do this, as First Child said, is through love. This maps the path back to God's house, that God may be created for us from the double quest of first man and first woman. If you're ever in Malibu, you might want to drop by Paradise Cove and say hello.